We have a presenter, so I want to make sure that we stay on track and on time today. I'm speaking from here because today's meeting, we're not live streaming, but we are recording. Welcome to our May Town Hall, and just a reminder that we do alternating updates and then drilling down into a substantive issue. So this month is drilling down into a substantive issue. We're going to start, though, as we normally do, with our land acknowledgement. We recognize that all of us at UW-Tacoma learn, live, and work on or near the ancestral homeland of the Coast Salish people. In particular, we are situated on the traditional territory of the Puyallup tribe. As people on this occupied territory, we have a responsibility to acknowledge the land, the ancestors who have cared for this land since time immemorial, and all our indigenous connections today. We also have a responsibility to acknowledge the history of dispossession and forced removal that have allowed for the growth and survival of this institution. In light of this history, let us take active efforts to partner with our indigenous community members and neighbors as we continue our work together as a community of learners, leaders, and educators. And land acknowledgements are just empty words if you don't do the work behind them to establish those partnerships. So I try every time I do this to give an example of some of the things that we're doing on campus to make the land acknowledgement real. And so I want to acknowledge, I don't see him, thank Leander, because he and Danica Stirrup-Miller from CASE are hosting next Friday, May 15th, a cedar bracelets weaving workshop with Peggy McLeod from the Puyallup tribe. And you all may know that Peggy is an elder, but she's also sort of the cultural icon for the Puyallup tribe and for this region, just in doing this work. And so this is available to all and open to all, and lunch will be provided by the Center for American Indian Studies, Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies next Friday at 12:30 in the family room at West Coast Grocery. So today, I'm going to switch, as you all know, in the announcement that went out, the University of Washington Seattle campus is on a different budget model than we have. So we use incremental budgeting here. They have ABB there, and they are studying and moving towards a new budget model called IBB. So I'm like, I don't know what all these, I'm going to leave it to Brittany to tell us what all those initials stand for. But what that means for us is it's a time for us to think about, should UW-Tacoma move from our existing model to align with IBB or something similar. You all may know that Bothell also has a different budgeting model. They use RCM, which is recovery cost something. I don't know what all these... Responsibility Sentence Management, but RCM. Brittany will go into all of those. But all three campuses have different budget models. And as part of operational excellence, as outlined in the strategic plan, we want to, at least the Seattle campus wants to move to a budget model that is more transparent in how the money comes in and is then distributed. And so they are spending the time now, and Sylvia from our campus is on the planning committee looking at this IBB model with a goal of going live in fall of 28. Is that right? Yes, fall of 28. So we are sitting here right now in spring of 26, and this is the kickoff for us here at Tacoma to start doing the work of looking at our own budget model, looking at others, and thinking about, should we change? So today is just the first conversation. We will spend all of next year, just so that you all know, all of next year looking at different opportunities, different things, and educating you all on what's happening as Seattle is moving to IBB. We're also going to be working on our own strategic plan next year. So it's an ideal time for us to be thinking about how it all fits. And then what I would like to do the following year is if we decide that we want to move forward with a different model here at UWT, start modeling for the campus, what would that look like? What would the numbers, how do the numbers sort of play out? And we would bring on a consultant to do that work, because when you move from one model to another, you actually have to have some kind of external expertise. And that's what Brittany represents, because the UW Seattle campus is using EAB as their consultant as they are doing the work of IBB, of moving towards IBB. So if we decide that this is something we want to move forward with in fall of 27, we would bring on a consultant and start thinking about that with the goal of going live with our new model if we decide to go that direction. I keep saying if because I don't know. It's if. And if we were going to go to a different model, we would launch that new model at the same time that the Seattle campus is launching theirs in fall of 28. So we need to do that work. So it's my pleasure to thank and welcome Dr. Brittany Motley. She has 18 years of experience in higher education, beginning as an instructional counselor and developmental math instructor before advancing to executive director for student support services. She later served as assistant vice president for academic affairs at a historically Black university, where she assisted with accreditation renewal. In 2017, she transitioned to consulting, allowing her to work with 2- and 4-year universities to build public-private partnerships and foster strategic ecosystems for change. An expert in leading change, which this is a major change for universities to do this kind of work, Brittany is here today to talk with us about the different university budgeting models, their challenges and their benefits, and what we might need to consider here at UWT as UW Seattle is working towards their new budget model. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brittany Motley. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, and happy Friday Eve, everyone. If you all can give me a thumbs up, is my sound okay? You all okay? Awesome, awesome. And I see the room. Well, this is wonderful. Beautiful hybrid environment. So as it was stated, my name is Brittany Motley. My expertise in higher ed, it is in leadership and change, but one of my favorite tools for leading change is the budget. And I will unpack this more why, but just to give you the cliff notes of it, it's because the budget tells me more about institutional strategic plans than their actual strategic plan. It lets me know if we can carry that thing out. But also, the budget is a powerful tool for incentivizing behavior to get that culture that we want on campus. So that's why that's one of my favorite tools when it comes to leading change. So as it was stated, we're going to talk about different budget models, how we see this play out in real time. We work with tons of institutions on this, and I have a few polls. I want to engage you all, so I will have a QR code for us to poll if you have your phone on you, but I will also leave time at the end for open Q&A. So please know if you have any questions, we will certainly want to hear those and get time for those. So just to jump in, to give you all a bit of a financial state of the sector, I have been in higher ed for the past 2 decades. And in all my time in higher ed, there has always been headlines critiquing our business model and our approach to business. We've always heard, is higher ed business model broken? What's happening there? What's going on? But it typically wasn't playing out the way to the severity that the headlines was claiming. I would say it wasn't until these past 2 years where I truly feel and see the pressure that the headlines are claiming, when it comes to what's happening with higher ed's business model. And that's what we have illustrated on this slide. This is looking at the cost and revenue side for all 4-year institutions and our outlook based on the common sources of cost and revenue that we see. So you can see on the cost side, we have all red and a bit of yellow there, signaling that the cost of running an institution, it has just went up severely. And this is driven mostly by material and utility costs. But also labor is standing in the way of that. That eats up over half of our institutional budgets. And this is a fixed cost that rises steadily. And so we're grappling with, how do we really deal with the cost side? Because if you'll shift to the right of the slide, on the revenue side, we're seeing some strains as well. Our number one and two sources of revenue, which are tuition and fees and government funding, those are under heavy external pressures that are not fully in our control because of things like the demographic cliff, weakened state budgets, and things of that sort. Now, for our silver linings, you will see a little bit of green on this slide, and it's in our advancement and investment spaces because we are seeing a lot of donor behavior that has increased, but I would say donor attitudes towards the sector has changed. There is this public distrust, so we're finding that funding, it's coming with a bit more strings attached, and we don't have the flexibility to kind of use those donors or those funds in the way that we want. It's going strictly into that restricted funds budget, or as I said, for specific initiatives. So we aren't really able to allocate or subsidize it in the way that we would want there. So what economists are calling this, is a term for it, is synchronized compression, because we are truly getting hit on both sides of the equation when it comes to the financial state of the sector. Now, often when I show this, here are common responses that we get on how do we lean into opportunities for revenue, or how do we lean into cost containment. Now, for the sake of being provocative, we have labeled these myths, but I won't say that they are lies. It's just we have to have some considerations when we think of them. So the first myth that we have here is that we will grow our way out of it. And while this has been true in the past, there are some things that we have to consider when we're thinking about that net tuition revenue and our enrollment pipeline and things of that sort. There are three threats to enrollment that we have to keep in mind. First is that demographic cliff. For one, we just have less humans. The other is non-consumption. So that's of the students who are graduating high school, many are opting out of choosing college. And they're doing this for a myriad of reasons. One is because they have more options, they have more flexibility. And so we're not just competing against our peers anymore. We're competing against trades, credentialing platforms, polytechnic institutions, things of that sort. And then the final one is market share. We have 6 times more institutions per capita than any other country. And so you can imagine how that's playing against the demographic cliff. We are vying for more students. And so it's causing kind of this market rationalization as well. And so we have to monitor all of those forces to enrollment when we're thinking about our enrollment strategy. We no longer have that luxury of the growth era that we've been in for the past decade. The second myth here that we get is we just need to cut the administrative bloat. We need to cut the admin side of the house to get rid of that. Everyone's overpaid over there. Kind of that's the second myth that we'll get. And while this one, we would say absolutely lean there. But what happens is when we lean into cuts, this is where we first make all of our cuts to the point where this side of the house is relatively lean. When we look at our public and private 4 years, and many are coming to us saying there's no more fat to trim there. We have to look into the academy, or we have to look into other spaces. And so our recommendation here is absolutely lean into making cuts on the administrative side of the house, or where we see top heaviness or things of that sort. But if we're already lean there, it's time for us to look into alternative ways. And then the final one here is the only fair strategy is to lean into across the board cuts. We need to do this equitably, or how can we spread the pain evenly and things of that sort. And there was a Gartner study that looked at this. They looked at this for higher ed and cross sector as well. So looking at other industries, and they found that organizations that did across the board cuts, they typically were in more debt 3 years after this than if they would have done nothing at all. And so when it comes to making cuts, we are not just saying do this in a blanket way, but do it in a very strategic way, because it will have ripple effects that sometimes are more costly than if we would do nothing when it comes to that. So this leads us to what will be our path going forward, knowing that we are in this era of synchronized compression. We're in this era of the demographic cliff, knowing that we have limited options, or we have to really fortify our strategy. what will be our two paths? And typically, traditionally, it has been let's find more. Let's find more so we can do more with more. But the other option that we're saying to lean into is how can we create more capacity in our existing resources? It's not margin or mission type of conversation. It's both and. It's not either or, but how do we do this most strategically? Because this more with more strategy, again, we just no longer have the luxury of that because we're not in this revenue growth period where we have this abundance of students who are enrolling at our institutions in the way that we used to think about it. So with this path we have going forward, this leads us into how do we optimize our budget model? How do we truly get this budget model to work for us? And before I lean into that, I want to launch the first poll that I have for you all. So if you all can pull out your cell phones and let me make this big for you. Are you all able to scan that QR code? And I would be curious of how would you describe, okay, I see the results coming in. So how would you describe your understanding of your institution's budget model here? See the polls coming in. Thank you all. Thank you, thank you, thank you for the responses. So we're seeing majority is not sure how it works. Some, about 22%, say I have a good sense. Some understand it pretty well, about 10%, and can explain it to others. So that is very cool. So for those of you all who can explain it to others, we need you to make sure that you're chiming in as we have questions and things of that sort. But we see that about over half is not really sure how it works. And this is often common. I'm going to unpack why. But first, let's define what we mean by a budget. And when we say budget, we often think spreadsheets, finances, number crunching, and things of that sort. But in higher ed, the budget is more than that. It's truly the institution story in financial terms. And so you can see the way that we defined it here. It's a process in which the institution really distinguishes between its wants and needs and then prioritizes those based on immediacy and impact. And so let me just unpack what I mean by that just a little further. Starting with the left of this slide, all of our institutions have this mission, right? This is the reason that the institution exists, the people that we benefit. This is the good that we do, our emotional logic for existing, our why. We take that mission and we translate it into a strategic plan. If you go all the way to the right of that slide, that last column, that's where we have that public-facing document that represents our goals, our prospective students, to our boards and donors of how we plan to live out our why. But as you can see, the two columns between that, it calls out the strategy and the strategic planning. Often, this part is left out of our strategic plan, ironically, and that's because this is the roadmap for laying out how we're going to do what we want to do, but it's also those detailed project plans of how we're going to translate those strategies into action and how we are going to resource them. So essentially what I'm saying here is our budgeting is the economic logic behind our strategic plan. This is truly how will we resource this? How will we walk our talk? How will we actually do those things? So it's putting the legs under that strategy. But as you can see on this slide, I really just want to double down on the emotional logic versus the economic logic. And it's shifting between those mindsets. This is often the hardest thing that our campus leaders deal with. I would say actually all C-suite leaders as well. I was just reading a case study about Lego, and they hire a psychoanalyst to come in and meet with their C-suite leaders about delineating emotional and economic logic. So again, this is not me finger pointing. This is just something that a lot of people think of as a professional development because it's hard to shift between those mindsets. And so one is focused on the why, The other is focused on how will we resource that why. And so that's what we mean by the role of a budget. Now, 5 ways that we see this play out, kind of 5 roles of a budget, is first, as I said, it's the financial representation of the institutional's plan. So this is that strategic, that economic logic between what we're doing. But then the second point here, it's that contract between management and our operating units of how we're going to carry out this plan. So it's also our operational plan, helps us understand how we're walking our talk. This serves to forecast the financial picture at a future time. So I need to know how much cash is on hand, how far can we sustain ourselves under what circumstances. That is what I want this budget to do, provide that financial picture for me. The fourth, it's an indicator for risk tolerance. It lets us know what we can take and what we can't take, very clear. And then the final one here, it's a political instrument. And politics represent our values. And so this is what we mean by a political instrument, is that it represents the values of the institution. It shows that we prioritize student success, we prioritize teaching, we prioritize collaboration and things of that sort. That plays out in the ways that we allocate expenses to incentivize behavior and things of that sort. So here are the 5 roles of a budget. Now, let me show you the budget models and how they play out in higher ed. Now, we've called this out in 2 ways. You see 2 budget models on this slide. One is centralized and one is decentralized. Now, for the centralized, we typically call that incremental budgeting. For the decentralized, we have a few names for that, and that was called out. Sometimes it's called RCM, sometimes IBB, sometimes ABB. They're all meaning the same thing, and that there's a bit of decentralization there. And for the acronyms, you all know we love to have the alphabet soup here. RCM is the responsibility center management. IBB is incentive-based budgeting, and ABB is activity-based budgeting. And as you can see, hearing the acronyms, they all do the same thing. So let me show you how this plays out. On the incremental side, this is where we get all of our funding, our tuition revenue, our appropriations. They come into a central pot, and then they are distributed evenly. And so units, they receive incremental increases if we've had an increase centrally, and they will receive incremental decreases if we've had some type of decrease centrally. And so you'll see how that plays out on the left. Now, on the right, the way that RCM works is you bring in all of that funding, and that funding is allocated to specific units to the colleges based on some type of activity formula. So whether this is student credit hours, majors, some type of algorithm that we develop to allocate those funds. And then the academic colleges, they pay some type of tax, is what we call it, based on the size and consumption of how they're engaging with different administrative units. And so I'm going to show how that plays out a few slides as well. But essentially, the funds go back to the colleges based on the activity that's happening at each college. And then each college is paying a percent, some type of tax or some type of cost to those administrative units based on how they're engaging with them as well. Now, first want to double down on incremental budgeting. Now, everything serves a purpose, and actually today we still see a huge chunk. I would say it's about probably 60% of universities use incremental budgeting, but we see that shifting a lot. And as I said earlier, incremental budgeting, it works best when you are in a high revenue growth period. And we call out some advantages of that in the top right. It's because it's very simple for academic leaders to understand and manage. It provides this equitable sharing of resources, and you get minimal disruption of the poaching amongst colleges or any of the political squabbling, because it's very, very clear. But what happens when we're no longer in that revenue growth period, we see these disadvantages emerge. And for one, there's no link between investments and outputs. We have no true accountability of how things are playing out on the cost and revenue side. And this is difficult to maintain when we don't have an abundance of revenue. And so the way that we show how this plays out on the left here, you'll see that we have 4 different colleges. They're each receiving those incremental funding, but each college has a different context that they're dealing with, which means a different narrative for their resources, right? And so this is how this shifts us from rethinking kind of that incremental structure to how can we do this in a more hybrid way or a different way where we still have some centralization, but we have some accountability as well. Now, the last thing I want to double down to on the incremental budgeting is the structures that this and how this plays out interpersonally with the people. And so let me show you this. Our budget models are structures and we behave within them. And so this is the cultural play out that I would say of an incremental model. It exacerbates the us versus them culture on our campuses. And so the perfect example of this that we have outlined is the faculty stereotypes versus the administrator stereotypes. We often hear faculty are lazy while administrators are overpaid, or faculty are resistant to change while administrators are obsessed with it, or faculty are completely oblivious to what's happening financially, and administrators reduce everything to the bottom line, to the dollars, right? I would blame the structure of this, the structure of our incremental budgeting. For one, yes, faculty are oblivious to these financial considerations if we haven't opened the black box, or if we're providing the same amount of funding incrementally every year. How do you know that net tuition revenue is down, right? If we're keeping things consistent on the faculty side through that budget model, you all don't understand, the implications there. And then on the administrative side, if the CFO or the CBO is the only leader who understands the finances and what's happening, of course, they're going to look obsessed with the dollar amount and the bottom line because they haven't distributed that cost responsibility or that financial awareness across the campus. And so to sum this slide up, I love to use the crabs in a barrel metaphor. People always say when they see crabs in a barrel, why are they climbing all over each other? Why is there conflict? And everybody's questioning the crab's behavior, but no one's questioning the barrel, right? The structure that the crabs are operating in, because we know that they don't behave that way in their natural habitat. And so when we see kind of things not playing out the way that we would want, or that us versus them culture on our campus, it's a structural issue and rarely an interpersonal issue. And so how do we redesign or redefine those structures so that can play out appropriately? So this leads us to seeing the full spectrum of budget models. On the left, you'll see that incremental, centralized, and on the right, it's decentralized. So think of RCM and IBB there. Now, the trend that we're seeing in the sector is being full left or full right is not the appropriate way. It's the hybrid approach to it. We'll say the best practice when it comes to picking budget models is truly the one that works for your institutional context. As I said on the centralized way, there's no incentive for cost control or revenue growth. It's difficult to maintain in periods like we are, but critiques on the RCM side as well is when we are too decentralized. A common term that we hear from leaders is the body dies while the limbs thrive, right? And so what we'll see is select colleges or those who have strong revenue growth, they will become very entrepreneurial and they're growing, but yet the rest of the institution is fading, right? And so we still need some type of mechanism or method of collecting central reserves so we can have that central pot of money. And so what we find is that institutions are shifting to the middle, where we do want to have some deallocation of costs. We do want to have that decentralization, but we still want to maintain a central pot of strategic reserves as well. And so it's shifting to that hybrid model of how do we keep the great things of incremental budgeting and the great things of RCM and put that together for our institutional context is where we're landing with that. So I want to shift next into the exact design principles, but before doing that, I have another poll for you all of what do you think your current budget model most encourages? Do you think it encourages stability, growth, efficiency, or is it hard to tell? Thank you all for your responses. We have majority hard to tell, some with stability. Then we're shaking out a little evenly around growth and efficiency. But this is completely fair on hard to tell, especially as I said, in incremental structures. You're just receiving consistent money with no true visibility into what's happening. So I can understand that it can be very hard to tell there. Thank you all for sharing out there. So, after talking to leaders, here are three critical areas that are demanding the most attention and how we want budget models to play out. The first is we wanted to create some type of financial accountability. And by that, we mean we want to align people so they understand the implications across the campus. We want all leaders to understand the implications of their decisions, the cost implications of their decisions. And so, how do we provide more of that visibility and give folks more authority around decision making and leaning more into that? The second is how do we preserve those mission critical activities? And so there are some things that we want to protect because they're absolutely mission critical, even though they may not generate enough revenue to sustain themselves. How do we subvent or provide some type of allocation to make sure that we're preserving the things that are really, really important to our institutional mission? And then the final one, how are we making sure everyone is rowing in the same direction? How are we using this as an alignment tool to really incentivize that culture in service of our strategic goals? Now, with the budget model, there are common critiques that we get or common questions of if we change, what's going to happen here? And so in this slide, we've captured common concerns. We have them bucketed in three areas and typical solutions that we'll see. So the first concern is what type of perverse behaviors could this possibly incentivize and how do we mitigate against that? The first one is this going to cause colleges to compete for students? Are departments going to be incentivized to lean into lower quality work or classes? And what's going to happen on the multidisciplinary work front? And the solutions that we call out here are truly building out the algorithm to accommodate this. So split revenue models, curricular review committees, faculty senate oversight, really thinking about our decision resolve, our shared governance structure, standardized MOUs, financial incentives. I call out all of these tactics just to say that there is a way to mitigate against this. There is a way to think and design against those perverse incentives that we typically see play out. The second concern we get is around cost. What about those high cost to teach programs? Will they be disadvantaged? Or what about the small programs that are unable to finance their operations? How does this play out for the haves and have-nots? And so with that, we have other solutions of how can we think of course fees? How can we weight credits to compensate high cost programs? Or how do, again, we think of subventing those things that are mission critical that may not be generating the revenue for self-sustainability? And then the final one, how are we ensuring that everything is aligned with our institutional priorities? How are we incentivizing that behavior through performance funding pots, allocations, revenue recapture pools, gain sharing, and things of that sort to really give folks skin in the game? Now, to show you an example of how this plays out, this comes from the University of Toronto. This institution, they had just shifted to a new RCM model, and their College of Arts and Sciences, as you can imagine, their largest college, they taught a high volume of engineering students in both required and elective courses. But the existing model, it didn't compensate arts and sciences for cross-teaching. And so what this caused, the way that this played out in their behavior, is they deprioritized their engineering students and scheduling and wait lists and things of that sort, and it's caused course access issues for those specific students. The other way that this played out is it caused them to add on a lot of sections at the end of the term, and they had to do a lot of non-tenure track adjunct hiring to supplement for those. Now, the ripple effect with this is in their College of Engineering, this started to lean into accreditation issues of what will happen because a certain amount of foundational courses must be taught by full-time staff. So with that, we lean back into looking at the budget to think about how we can incentivize behavior there. So 4 steps on the right here. We first calculated the full cost of instruction for each section. So this was looking at direct teaching costs, the divisional overhead, and then the university overhead costs. Then we took the sum of all arts and science sections that engineering students were completing in, took both of those sums and divided them by each other, simple math here, and this told us the percentage of total engineering students that arts and sciences was supporting. We then reallocated the revenue based on that. Now, after a year of doing this, I want to show how this incentivized behavior from this. First, the College of Arts and Sciences, they started creating priority seats for these students. They opened up night classes for these students, but this also leaned into great cost containment because instead of having to open up those last minute sections and hire adjunct instructors, they were able to do better course planning. Instead of being reactive, they were now in a more proactive role, and this was able to increase the full-time faculty hires and reduce that spending that they were using for adjuncts in that way. So this is just a quick story of how shifting and massaging the algorithm and really thinking about the nuances of our schools and how the budget can inform that. So this is the way that the RCM budget model really supported this dean because they were able to get access to that granular data in that way. Now, just to close us out and to round out this section before talking about design principles, this is the typical questions that we'll get. And we have them bucketed as low priority questions that drive campus debate, key lessons for productive conversation, and better questions to guide those discussions. I won't ask you to read this slide, but know that you will have these in follow-up. But I want to call your attention to this last column here on the right on what are the better questions that we need to guide. Regardless of the acronym, the way that this works out, this is how we recommend that institutions build their budget. First, asking yourself, do we adequately incentivize the behaviors we want to encourage? Are resources better spent institutional-wide or in individual unit growth? Does the administration have enough funding to implement our strategic plan? And then the final one here, the most important question when it comes to selecting a budget model is what elements of our budget model should we change to achieve our strategic goals? That is the number one question. Others, we find them to be distracting. They get us into debates. They cause us to swirl. This is where we want to focus. What are the elements that we should change to make sure that we can carry out our strategic goals? So with that, let me show you how this plays out by talking through some budget model design principles. We have 4 lessons that we learned from working with leaders in budgets. First is you want to let all institutional goals drive that revenue allocation. That is your true north for all things, is that strategic mission right there. The second is we want to look at cost allocation, but we want to keep everything simple. If we have to over-explain, over-define our metrics and how we calculated them, we've probably lost before starting, right? We want to keep things very, very simple and talk about them in a way that people feel they have control over costs, but not that their hands are tied. The third lesson here is we want to incorporate those performance targets into budget allocations. And so we want to make sure that we're driving the cultural elements that we really want to see played out in our institutional culture. And then the final one here, we need a rainy day fund. We need kind of that pot of strategic reserves to make sure that we can fund our institutional mission, pivot in real time, have some funding for risk and things of that sort. So we want to take these 4 elements and then we combine them we take these design lessons and then we combine them with this periodic table of what we call budget elements. Now you'll see 4 colors on this slide. The navy blue is around revenue allocation. So what are all the ways that we could allocate revenue? We typically see this done through student credit hours and majors. I'll show you this next. Then cost allocation. How do we assign expenses for university overhead? What are the ways that we can think about that? The orange is those strategic funding moments. For those sources of funding, how are we using those? How are we bringing those in and allocating them appropriately? And then the final one, performance targets. What are those mechanisms that we're using to inflect behavior? So again, those 4 lessons, wrapping up these budget model elements, this is how we're recommending that institutions build out a budget model that truly works for their campus culture. So let me show you a few examples around this. First, talking financial accountability. Now, the highest level of distilling down that accountability is allocating revenue. And one way we see this is determining the percentage of tuition revenue that should be allocated back to the academic units through some type of activity-based formula. Now, on here, we have another spectrum. You can see that you can do this through credit hours and or majors. Now, the most of the institutions that we track, they lean more towards credit hours than majors, but they do have a combination of both. And as you can see, because credit hours, if we lean solely on that for revenue allocation, that can incentivize that poaching students from other colleges and things of that sort. And if we look totally at majors, we miss the nuances of the cost of teaching and the activity that's happening around teaching. So here is where we find that perfect middle, where you'll see most institutions fall between 85 and 15 or 70 and 30. Now, again, the common question we get is, what's the right answer here? What's the right ratio? As you can see from majority of our institutions, the revenue split, it really depends on what you want to incentivize, but there's no magic number when it comes to this. Now, another way that we see this play out, this example comes from UC Riverside and the way that they allocate revenue back to their units and departments. They have 60% based on student credit hour, 20% for majors, and then they incorporate a 20% performance funding pot. Now, for that 20%, 10% is used for retention gains and 10% is used for graduation rates. Again, because that's the behavior that they want to incentivize, that's aligned with their institutional mission. They really, really want to double down on that retention and graduation. But I love one thing they call out here is colleges are not penalized when students change majors. So they're also taking into account the nuances, student behavior, and things of that sort. Again, getting people to engage with it, but in a way where they feel that they can control these metrics and have control over them. Now, another example of this comes from UK. This is the University of Kentucky, and this is how their performance pot incentivizes improved retention across their colleges. So they have this $5 million performance pot. They split this by 75% and 25%. 75% goes towards their undergrad retention, 25% goes towards their graduate retention gains. Now, they create this dollar per student award rate by looking at the money that they have in this pot and then dividing it by the first-time full-time students that were retained from fall to fall. They then take this number and they allocate it back to the colleges based on their year-over-year retention increases. And as you can see, the awards across their colleges here were amazing. They had 10 out of 11 of their colleges improved retention here. So the incentive worked, right? It had this cultural impact, but also this institutional impact when it comes to their retention rates. And they saw a 32 percentage point increase in the number of students that were retained just in their College of Business and Economics here. Now, one thing I'll call out here is one college tried to game the system. And so they tried to lean into more elective teaching for that. But again, they weren't able to because it didn't impact their retention in that way. And so this is why you see that 10 out of 11 of their undergrad colleges improved in that way. So these are the different ways that we see that people allocate revenue to incentivize behavior that is in line with the institutional mission. I now want to shift to how do we allocate cost? One common thing we hear from schools is that costs some are easy and some are hard to measure. And how do you provide a return on this? And so we've labeled this out of things that are harder to measure versus easier. And so on that hard front, things like our bursar, registrar, public safety, admissions, leaning into library, IT administration, and things of that. Those are harder to measure the cost of utilizing those administrative services. And then we have others like when you think of space and utilities that require metering, those are easier to measure. And so this is the two plots that we use when leaders are thinking about this. If you look at our X and our Y axis, we have two important filters here. How easy is it to measure it? And what will be the level of unit control? Because again, as I said, we want people to feel that they have some control over the things that we're holding them accountable for. And so the top two things that are easy to measure and that units feel they have control over is thinking of utilities and space. Those are fairly easy. IT support, we can quantify that a bit easy as well. But I want to call your attention to that lower quadrant where you see those business services, library costs, student services, general administration. Those are things that are harder to quantify. And we also don't want to disincentivize or have people disengage with these services as they understand how they're using them. We want to keep utilization high with these. And so what we often see is that people will build a cost pool where they will lump those together and just assign a certain tax to that people will pay for those administrative services. But again, with things like space and utilities, we can keep those metered at separate cost pools, but then for everything else, we can put that into a different pool. The final lesson here is when we're thinking about our central strategic reserves, how are we keeping that centralization so we can have more agility with all the uncertainty that we're seeing on the external forces that's impacting our finances. And so here is an example of this. This is from a representative tuition revenue model. This is an institution that would have an RCM. So you can see that they're bringing in that tuition revenue. 90% of that is going directly back to the academic units based on whatever activity-based formula that the institution would align. 10% of that is going to a subvention fund. That fund does a couple of things. It has hold harmless funding. Hold harmless is where we will basically allow a certain year or two when we switch models that nothing will change in your finances. So we will give a year to work out our kinks or two, depending on how that works as we shift to the new model. So we need some funding there. We need to have some funding for our capital projects and then strategic reserves. And this is for those strategic initiatives that we want to make sure we're funding, or if we're a research institution, we want to make sure that we have seed funding and things of that sort. Want to call out again, the biggest flaw when shifting to IBB or RCM or any form of decentralized modeling is the limbs thrive while the body dies. And so we recommend that if you're going into more decentralization, you do want to collect some type of central funding. And with that, the last thing I want to call out here is how subvention is used, because subvention, it can become a downward spiral, like it's defined on this slide here. Here's an example of an institution. So starting in 2007, they launched this new decentralized model, but the recession hit. And so the leadership kept these certain units on subvention. But then other things happened. After that, COVID happened. After that, the demographic clip. There will always be something where we can find an excuse to keep institutions on subvention, right? And so it leads you to these two quotes at the bottom. One is from a CBO in Canada that I work with, and he said, making units whole with subvention when they should be in deficit, it's just like incremental budgeting, right? We find ourselves back in that space, even though we're claiming that we shifted to a new decentralized model. So how do we solve for this where we have to do subvention? What are the two ways that we can think about it? So here are the ways that Miami University does this. They have bridge subvention, which is a temporary subvention, and then they have mission critical subvention, where this is long-term subvention into perpetuity. So the two ways that they define this is first, they set upfront expectations for the subvention of the model period. Miami is on an RCM model as well. So for example, here they had their leaders in the College of Engineering. They had some growth potential. So they were able to give them some tools a time frame to lean into that, and then this is when we will pull your subvention back, right? Because you just needed this temporarily for this moment. Whereas when you think of their College of Creative Arts, they're unlikely to become financially independent in the near future, but they're very, very necessary to the mission of this institution. It's a very attractive program and things of this sort. They're going to continue to receive that subvention permanently because of their mission critical nature. So it was truly defining and finding the data points that will say, what defines temporary subvention towards what will be that mission critical long term? And how are we making this clear and empowering units to thrive within those times? Because even if a unit is on long term subvention, we still want to have some type of accountability there as well. And so, how are we making sure that we have this standard, even though we're thinking of subvention in that way? So those are the design principles. Now let me share out how this plays out culturally and what we see here. As I said, as a change management expert, I find a lot of my work
Brittany,
is grief. Yes,
Can I
yes.
just make sure I'm doing a time check? We are going to run out of time.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, let's shift to closing out here. I will close out right here. These are the stages of grief as it relates to a budget adjustment. And so as you all know, that change is interpreted as loss sometimes. We are losing something because we're shifting to a new thing. So it often puts us through the stages of grief, and 4 of them are outlined here. First, you're going to be angry about it. That's often the feedback we get. And we say during this stage, lean into feedback. What we see about doing new budget models is it takes a year or 2 of massaging. And by that, I mean getting feedback, going back and changing that algorithm, seeing how that plays out, going back and changing that allocation method, seeing, how this plays out, shifting that cost pool. And so there's a lot of that during that stage. And so it takes having feedback mechanisms and being in lockstep will be essential. And then eventually you'll see that you go into that stage of acceptance and adaptation there. I want to completely stop here and open the floor and hear from you all. I'm sure you have questions. What questions do you have? And forgive me for going over time here.
And if you do have a question, she won't hear you unless you have one of these microphones. So if you do, raise your hand and we will bring a microphone to you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was really informative. This might not be an easy question to answer, and it might take a long time. So we'll see what happens. So some of the metrics for thinking about budgeting, tying the budget to, are related to credits and majors and other things that are more related to the academic units. What are some ways to define metrics for non-academic units, like administrative units, whose metrics might not be consistent across them and are maybe a little fuzzier?
Great question. It is looking at it's hard to think of this abstractly, but looking at cost and utilization could be the way to think of those non-academic units. And depending on the nuances of it, if it's not distributed evenly, that would be something that we would think of a tax for. How can we make sure that you're receiving the funding through a tax or some type of specific allocation, since it's not clearly defined in a quantifiable way?
Example is under the ABB model that UW Seattle uses right now, they hold back 30%, and that's what pays for all the central services and allows some of this incentive funding as well. So 70% is allocated out to the academic units, and then 30% is used to pay for the central part.
Thank you.
It's a quiet crowd today.
Well, wow, I actually do have one last poll I would like to.
One quick question before or actually, as people are taking the poll, why don't you ask your question?
I'm a student here for the civil engineering program as a junior, and I'm just curious in sitting here because I've just realized that the seniors were able to have some adjunct professors come in and teach courses that are now questionable whether they'll be available as a credit program. So my concern was just like, how is it that we're unable to afford these teachers to come in a program that is showing growth overall, and an ABET accreditation is required to take these courses?
Let me answer that question offline after, if you're willing to stay for a few minutes. Thanks. Because I really don't know the answer. First, I'm hearing of that. So that's a very specific question.
So have you opened the poll?
Yes, is it?
I'm getting an error message.
It's just not showing the,
Oh, man. Okay. Well, it was this, I did this as my backup slide if the poll didn't work. What would you most want a budget model to do for you? I would be very curious about that. Is it provide more transparency, better align resources, give units more flexibility, clearer incentives, protect mission critical programs, make costs more visible? Just wanted to close out with this question because you all's why will be incredibly important for how you build every aspect of this model. And so starting and constantly reminding yourselves of that and reinforcing that will be very important for this process.
Right. I think that's where we'll start with our next educational journey here, because I don't know that I think we want all of those things. And I'm not sure that even as chancellor I could prioritize, but it's like we want all of those things.
Yes.
But how we get all of those things is possibly not possible. So let's start there. And as I said, this is just the beginning of the conversation. I wanted people to understand, where we are, as we're on incremental, just like 66% of other universities. We're doing it the old-fashioned way. Bothell and Seattle have moved beyond that. The ABB model came into being at UW Seattle, it was 2006 or 7. It was the year I was a vice president. We started talking about it. And they found, just like she said, that they've gone to this subvention permanently for some things. So that's part of why they're looking at the model. They've tried to tweak it. They've had processes in place to make adjustments as they've gone along. But now it's like, okay, let's move to a totally different model, because that old ABB model was not working the way that it was intended. So there is a taxing system that is, as I said, in the current one, it's a flat tax. And you all know that we pay a lot of fees for everything. We get taxed 10% here at Tacoma, plus then we pay fees for other things like library, like advancement, and those things. In the new model, they are looking, in IBB, they're looking at how all of that taxing works. So that's going to be important for us here. Even if we don't change our budget model, we may be taxed in a different way, given the way that Seattle is moving to this IBB model. So it's an ideal time also for us to rethink what we're doing, because we're going to be impacted by the IBB model just because of the taxing structure that's in the new model. And I have asked that as they're looking at this, as they're doing this work, that they look at all of the fees that we pay. So we pay a technology fee, we pay 10% on every gift, and we pay fees for the library. So it's like and we pay the 10% of our tuition revenue. So we just need to be clear on what we're being taxed for and how we're being taxed as we move forward.
What is the next public step?
Okay, that's a great question, Tim. That's why I just love working with you so much. And the next public step is, so next June is a public update. So we will start the fall quarter with, the September will be an update, and then October will be another budget one, okay? So we've got time. Like I said, we've got a whole year to do the education and work. And I think what would be helpful for me also, if you all have questions about any of the models that you would want us to answer specifically, get those to Joe so that we can build our next educational session around that specifically, answering those questions around the models. Mintha, did you have a question?
Just wanted to follow up with Brittany. Did you say that these slides will indeed be available for us to access, or portions of them?
Yes.
We also have a budget compendium. We have tons of resources on eab.com. You all can use your .edu emails to set up a profile, and you can log in and you can just type in budget in the search and go crazy with it. But happy to provide any examples of what institutions are doing, how they're doing it, how they're adjusting in real time.
Ben has a question.
Hey, my understanding is that Seattle is running an ABB with the IBB model concurrently for 26-27 so that they can see what the impact of IBB will be. Are we also going to be running a model simulation all of next year to see if IBB's impacts will affect us in dramatic ways? Okay.
No, we would not. So I'm just going to go back to my notes and make sure I have my timeline right. So this is fall 26 that we're starting. We're going to spend the whole of next academic year getting up to speed and asking hard questions about models. The next year, 27, 28, we'll have more deliberate conversations, and that's when we would be sort of modeling, if we were to do this, what data do we have on student credit hours and majors, and how might it play out in different schools? So we will spend all of 27, 28 doing that work. And then with a goal of 28, if we're going to do something, we probably would have to think about, is 28 the year that we go live with both models? Or is 28 the year that we just jump off the cliff and along with Seattle? I think depending on what happens next year as we're doing this education and research, and then in 27 as we're doing the deeper dive with the numbers and the data, and how comfortable we would be just jumping off the cliff and just saying, we're going to go for it. I think we would have the Seattle experience because they will be running the two the year before to see how it played out. And one of the things I'd like to do is get someone from Bothell and Seattle to come and talk to us about how the faculty and student services or the administrative services, how they have experienced the models under ABB and RCM that they're using to help us understand what issues we might run into as we go forward. Okay, so we've got 2 years here. I know it seems like, but I want you all to know 2 years goes by very, very, very fast. So, but we do have 2 years of planning and 2 years to ask the questions and to get ourselves up to speed on what we would like to do as a campus, because we're not obligated to go to IBB, but we will be impacted by the taxing system. Okay, great. Thank you all. Thanks so much for making time today. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Join me in thanking Brittany for making time. I just appreciate it.
Thank you.
And a reminder, this is recorded and will be available on the budget website along with the slides.